What you are about to hear never happened. There is no record of it in any newspaper from that year. There is no line in any government ledger, no photograph in any archive, no name carved into any monument. And that, depending on who you ask, is either proof that the whole thing is nonsense or proof of exactly how well it was buried. So let's do something strange together. For the length of this story, and only for the length of this story, let's pretend it was real. Let's imagine that on a cold grey morning in the spring of 1894, the people living along the southern shore of Lake Erie woke up, looked out their windows, and saw that the lake was gone. Not all of it. Not the whole inland sea that stretches from Buffalo to Toledo, but a long, wide stretch of it, miles of open water that had been there the night before, had simply dropped. 14 feet, the story goes. 14 feet of water vanished overnight, exposing a floor of cracked mud and stranded fish and something else. Something no one could explain. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Something that, by the end of that same week, the United States Army would supposedly bury again under as much water as it took to make sure no one ever saw it. This is a story people still whisper about in certain corners of the internet. It is almost certainly not true. But stick with me, because the more interesting question is not whether it happened. The more interesting question is why so many of us desperately want it to be. Let me set the scene. In 1894, the shore of Lake Erie was not the quiet stretch of summer homes and marinas it would later become. It was working country. Fishing boats went out before dawn and came back heavy. Ice houses lined the water, packed with sawdust and frozen blocks cut from the lake in winter. The towns were small, the kind of places where everyone knew the sound of everyone else's wagon, and the biggest news of any given week was usually a storm rolling in off the water or a barge running aground. This was a country still stitching itself together. The wounds of the Civil War were 30 years old and not yet healed. The railroads had only recently bound the coasts into a single nation, and the men who ran them were richer than kings. Out west, the frontier was being declared closed, the maps filled in, the blank spaces coloured over. It was a moment when America had begun to believe it understood its own land completely, that the age of discovery was finished, that whatever wonders existed had already been found and fenced and ticketed. People wanted to believe the surprises were over. That belief is exactly the thing our story comes to break. The lake itself was a character in everyone's life. It fed them, it drowned a few of them every year, and it kept its secrets the way large bodies of water always do. People understood that things sank into Erie and never came back. Wrecks, cargo, men. The lake took what it took. Nobody expected it to ever give anything back. And Erie, of all the Great Lakes, had a reputation. It was the shallowest of the five, which meant it was the most temperamental. A calm surface could turn into a wall of water in an afternoon. Sailors feared it more than the deeper lakes, precisely because it was unpredictable, because it could rise and fall and rage in ways the others did not. So when the story asks you to believe that this particular lake did something violent and sudden and strange, it is leaning on something real. Erie was always the one that behaved like it had a temper. The legend simply asks, what if that temper hid something underneath? Which is why, in our story, the morning of the great drop felt less like a tide going out and more like the world turning inside out. The way the tale is told, it began with the fishermen. They were the first ones up, the way they always were, walking down to the water in the dark to ready their boats, and when they reached the shoreline, they stopped. Because the shoreline was not where it was supposed to be. The water had pulled back. Not gently, not the slow retreat of a low tide, because Lake Erie does not really have tides worth mentioning. This was something else. The water had dropped straight down and pulled away from the land, leaving behind a vast plain of glistening lake bed that stretched out farther than any of them could see in the dark. Fish flopped in shallow pools. The smell hit them first. that thick mineral stink of mud that has never seen the sun. And somewhere out in that exposed plain, half buried in silt, something caught the first weak light of morning and held it. They stood there, the story says, for a long time before anyone spoke. One of them walked out onto the mud and then came running back, and he could not explain what he had seen, only that the others had to come and look. So they did. They left the boats. They walked out together onto the floor of the lake, in the dark, with their lanterns held high, and the light fell on something none of them had words for. It was straight. That was the thing none of them could get past. Nature does not do straight lines. Rivers wander, coastlines curve, rock cracks in jagged random ways, but out there on the floor of the lake, running off into the dark in a line so clean it looked drawn with a ruler, was a road. A paved road. Now, I want you to really sit with how impossible that is, because the impossibility is the entire point of the legend. We are not talking about a few flat stones. We are not talking about a natural rock formation that sort of looks like a path if you squint. The story insists on something specific. A surface. Fitted blocks, or great poured slabs, depending on who is telling it, laid edge to edge with a craftsmanship that did not look hurried or crude. A road built to last. A road built by people who expected it to be used, and it ran out into the deepest part of the lake, in a direction that led nowhere any living person had ever heard of. There was no shore where it pointed, no island, no far landing on the other side that anyone could name. It went out and down into water that, even with the lake drained, still swallowed it in shadow, as if the road continued under depths that the drop had not been deep enough to reveal. Wherever it was going somewhere that no longer existed, or had never been put on any map the townspeople had ever seen. Word travelled the way word travels in small towns, which is to say almost instantly. By mid-morning, the lake bed was crowded. Farmers left their fields. Shopkeepers locked their doors and walked down to the water. Children ran out across the cracked mud, ignoring the shouts of their mothers, and stood on the surface of the road, stamping their feet on stone that had no business existing. People knelt down and ran their hands over the joints between the blocks. They talked about how tight the seams were. They argued about who could have built it. Some said it had to be old, older than the country, older than anyone could account for. Others refused to believe it was anything but a trick of the silt, a pattern in the rock, until they were standing on it themselves and could feel under their boots that it was made. And the arguments got heated, because the road forced a question that nobody in that crowd was equipped to answer. If it was old, how old? And if it was older than the settlers, older than the natives anyone had records of, older than the textbooks allowed, then who? Who had stood on this shore before there was a shore, and laid a road into water that should have always been there? Every answer anyone offered only made the next question worse. So mostly they stopped offering answers and just stared, the way you stare at something your mind cannot file away. And here is where the story does something clever, because it gives you just enough detail to make you lean in. They say a schoolteacher, a careful and unexcitable woman, walked the length of the exposed road counting her steps, and lost count somewhere past 2,000. They say a retired surveyor laid a level against the stones and found them graded, deliberately sloped, the way an engineer slopes a road for drainage. They say a boy pried up a smaller block from the edge and carried it home, and that it was heavier than any stone that size had a right to be, and that it was gone from his family's porch within the week, along with, eventually, a great deal of the family's willingness to talk about any of it. They say an old fisherman knelt and brushed the silt from a single block near the water's edge, and found marks cut into the stone, not random scratches, symbols, lines and curves arranged with intent, the way letters are arranged, except they were no letters he knew, and no letters the schoolteacher knew, and no letters anyone who looked at them that day could place. He covered them back up with mud, the story goes, because looking at them too long made him feel like the ground was tilting. The story is full of details like that, specific, vivid, just out of reach, the kind of details that feel like memory. And that is not an accident. A good legend is never vague where it counts. It is vague about the things you could check, and precise about the things you cannot, and that precision is what makes it feel like testimony instead of invention. There is a version of the story that lingers on that first night, after the crowds had gone home and the lake stayed down. They say a few of the men could not sleep, and went back out to the shore with lanterns, and stood at the edge of the mud, looking at the dark line of the road running off into the deeper dark beyond it. They say the night was unnaturally still, the way it gets before weather turns, and that the exposed lake bed gave off a cold that did not feel like ordinary cold. One of them, the story goes, walked a little way out alone, and then stopped, and then came back without a word, and would only say later that he had felt watched, not by anyone on the shore. By something further out, where the road went down into water, the drop had not been deep enough to drain. Whether that is a real piece of the legend, or something a teller added one night to frighten a listener, it does not matter. It does the job. It makes the road feel like it was pointing at something, and that the something might have been pointing back. For 2 days, the way the tale is told, the road belonged to the town. 2 days of people walking out at dawn to see it again, half expecting the water to have returned in the night, and finding it still there, still impossible, still waiting. Children were warned away, and went anyway. A travelling photographer was said to have set up his camera and made plates of the whole length of it, and people lined up to be in the pictures, standing on the road with their hats in their hands, like they were posing in front of a cathedral. For 2 days, it was the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to any of them, and they had no idea it was about to be taken away. By that second afternoon, the news had reached the cities. And this is the part of the tale where the tone shifts, where the wonder starts to curdle into something colder. Because the next people to arrive were not curious neighbours. They were men in uniform. The way the legend tells it, the army moved with a speed that did not make sense for the time. Think about what 1,894 actually was. No interstate highways, no telephone in most homes, no way to mobilize men and materials at the speed we take for granted now. Moving an army unit anywhere was a matter of trains and telegraphs and days of planning. And yet, in this story, soldiers were on the shore of Lake Erie, within what people swore was hours. Not a day or two. Hours. As if they had not been dispatched in response to the news, but had been waiting for it. As if someone, somewhere, had always known this might happen, and had a plan ready for the moment it did. That detail is the hinge the whole legend swings on. The speed, because a slow response is just government doing what government does. But a response that arrives before it should have been possible suggests something far more unsettling. It suggests foreknowledge. It suggests that the road was not a surprise to everyone, and the soldiers, people noticed, did not act surprised. That was the detail the witnesses supposedly could not shake. The men in uniform did not gawk. They did not walk out onto the road and marvel at it the way every other newcomer had. They moved like men who had been briefed, who already knew what they would find, who had a list of tasks and were working through it. They did not ask the townspeople what had happened. They told the townspeople what was going to happen now. The soldiers, the story goes, did not come to study the road. They came to get rid of it. First, they cleared the lake bed. They pushed the crowds back to the old shoreline, and then back farther, off the mud entirely, up onto the land. People who refused to leave were made to leave. The school teacher with her 2,000 steps, the surveyor with his level, the families who had spent 2 mornings marvelling at the impossible thing under their feet. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. All of them were herded back behind a line and told, in the way that men with rifles tell you things, that the matter was now the business of the United States government, and no longer any of theirs. The photographer's plates were taken. That is one of the most repeated details in the whole legend, and you can see why it survives, because it answers the obvious objection before you can raise it. Where are the pictures? The pictures, the story says, were carried off in a wooden crate by a young officer who would not say his name, along with the photographer himself, who returned 3 days later, pale and quiet, and who never made another plate of anything as long as he lived. Whether that is meant to be a threat or a kindness, the story leaves to you. Then the soldiers went to work on the road itself. Some versions of the story say they photographed it first, methodically, every section, and that those photographs went into a crate that went onto a train that went somewhere east and was never seen again. Some say they measured it, sketched it, even pried up sample blocks and packed them in straw. And some of the darker tellings say they did none of that they were not there to record anything at all, that they were there only to make it disappear, and that whatever the road was, whatever it might have proven, was of no interest to them beyond the speed with which it could be hidden. And then, the legend says, they refilled the lake. This is the part that, if you stop and think about it for even 10 seconds, falls completely apart. And the story knows that. The story leans into it. Because how do you refill a lake? How do you put 14 feet of water back across miles of lake bed in a matter of days? You cannot pour it from anywhere. You cannot truck it in. The amount of water we are talking about is beyond comprehension, more than any pump or pipe or human effort of that century could possibly move. To raise Lake Erie by even a single foot, you would need to add a volume of water so vast that the largest engineering projects in human history would not come close. 14 feet, across the area the legend describes, is a quantity that defeats the imagination. There is no army, no nation, no century that could do it by force. And the story knows this. It depends on it. And so the legend is forced into one of two explanations, and both of them are wilder than the road itself. The first explanation is that they did not bring the water back. They let it back. That the drop had been caused by something deliberate in the first place, some control, some mechanism, some structure out in the lake that someone had opened and could just as easily close. Pull a lever, and the water goes down. Push it back, and the water returns. In this version, the road was never the strangest thing on the lake bed. The strangest thing was whatever had been holding the water back, and whatever the army went out there to quietly shut again. Sit with that version for a moment, because it is the one that does the most damage to your sense of the ordinary world. It does not just claim there was an old road. It claims that the lake itself is a thing that can be operated. That somewhere under all that water is a mechanism old enough and powerful enough to move an inland sea, built by the same lost hands that laid the road, and that someone in 1894 knew where it was and how to work it. In this telling, the army did not bury a discovery. They closed a door, and the road was just what you could see through it before it shut. The second explanation does not bother with machinery at all. It simply says the water came back the same way it left. Suddenly. Overnight. As if the lake itself had been told to forget what it had shown, and obeyed. Either way, the result was the same. By the end of that week, the people who had walked out onto an ancient paved road woke up to find Lake Erie exactly where it had always been. Flat, grey, ordinary, lapping at the same shoreline it had lapped at for as long as anyone could remember. The mud was gone, the fish were gone, the soldiers were gone, and the road was gone, sealed back under 14 feet of cold water as though it had never surfaced at all. And here is the cruelest part of the tale, the part that makes it stick. Nobody talked about it. Not because they were sworn to secrecy, though some versions say they were, but because of something quieter and more human than that. Because within a few weeks, the people who had stood on that road began to doubt that they ever had. Memory is a soft thing. When the entire world around you insists that the lake never moved, that there was no road, that there were no soldiers, that nothing happened, your own certainty starts to erode. You stop bringing it up at dinner because of the way people look at you. You stop bringing it up at all. And eventually, you are not sure anymore whether you saw a road under the lake or whether you dreamed it, and you decide it is easier and safer and kinder to yourself to simply let it go. The schoolteacher never spoke of it again. The surveyor moved away, the story says, and took a position in another state, and when an old colleague wrote to ask him about the rumour years later, he sent back a single line saying he had no memory of any such thing, in handwriting that was said to shake. The boy who took the block grew into an old man who, on his deathbed, supposedly tried to tell his grandchildren about the road under the lake, and was gently told to rest, because the poor man was clearly confused. The old fisherman who found the symbols stopped going out on the water at all, and people said he would stand at the shore at dusk and stare at the spot where the road had been, and that he never said why. And so the road went back to being a secret, not locked in a vault, just dissolved into the gap between what a few people swore they saw and what everyone else knew to be impossible. That is the story. That is the whole legend, more or less, in the form it gets passed around today. And now I have to be honest with you, because you have been generous enough to imagine all of that as real, and you deserve the truth in return. None of it happened. Lake Erie did not drop 14 feet in 1894. The lake's levels are some of the most carefully measured numbers in North American history, recorded month after month, year after year, going back well before that date, and there is no plunge, no anomaly, no missing week, where the water simply went away. There was no paved road. There was no army of soldiers refilling an inland sea in a matter of days, because no army on earth, then or now, could do such a thing. There was no schoolteacher, no surveyor, no boy with a block, no fisherman with his symbols. I invented those people while I was telling you the story, the same way the legend invents its own. The whole tale is a piece of folklore wearing the costume of history. It is fiction. I told it to you as fiction, and it remains fiction. So, why does it exist? And why, when you first heard the title of this story, did some small part of you want it to be true? That is the part actually worth talking about. Stories like this one belong to a much larger family of modern legends. You may have brushed up against them before. Tales of impossibly old roads and buildings hidden in plain sight. Tales of a forgotten civilization that was more advanced than ours, whose works were erased and whose history was rewritten so thoroughly that we no longer remember they existed. Tales where the people in charge always seem to know more than they admit, and always seem to arrive just in time to bury whatever the rest of us were not supposed to find. These stories scratch a very specific itch. They take a world that can feel flat and explained and disenchanted, a world where every blank space on the map has been filled in, and they pour mystery back into it. They suggest that the ground under your feet might be hiding something wondrous, that the official version of the past is incomplete, maybe deliberately so, that you, the person hearing the story, might be one of the few willing to see what others refuse to. And, honestly, there is something beautiful in that hunger. The desire to believe the world is stranger, and older, and more secret than we were taught, is not a stupid desire. It is the same impulse that drives real explorers, and real archaeologists and real scientists out into the field to dig. The difference is only in what we do with it. One path leads to evidence, to careful measurement, to the slow and genuinely thrilling work of uncovering what is actually there. The other path leads to a story about a road under Lake Erie that feels true precisely because it can never be checked. Because notice how the legend protects itself. Every part of it is built so that the absence of proof becomes the proof. There are no records. That is because they were destroyed. No photographs survive. They were seized. No witnesses came forward. They were silenced. Or they doubted themselves into silence. The story is a sealed loop. It cannot be disproven because it has already explained away everything that would disprove it. And a story that can never be wrong is not history. It is faith. That is the tell. That is how you spot one of these stories every single time, no matter how good it is. Ask what evidence would change its mind, and listen to the answer. A real account of the past welcomes the question. It says, here are the records, here are the measurements, here is how you could check me, and here is what would prove me wrong. The legend does the opposite. It treats the demand for proof as part of the cover-up. The very fact that you cannot find the road becomes the proof that someone hid it. Once a story reaches that point, it has stopped describing the world and started defending itself, and those are very different things. There is a comfort hidden inside the despair of these stories, and it is worth naming. To believe that a greater civilization came before us, that its roads and works still wait under the water and the soil, is in a strange way more hopeful than the alternative. It means we are not the peak. It means the world has been wondrous before and could be again. It means the greyness of an ordinary life sits on top of buried magnificence, and that the magnificence is not gone, only hidden, only waiting. That is a powerful thing to offer a person who feels small. The legend does not just sell mystery. It sells the idea that you are living on top of a forgotten greatness, and that you, by believing, are keeping its memory alive when the powerful would rather you forgot. It is flattering. It is consoling. And none of that makes it true. The real history under Lake Erie is, for what it is worth, genuinely interesting on its own. There are real shipwrecks down there, hundreds of them, preserved in the cold, fresh water in a way the salt oceans could never manage, some of them still standing on the bottom with their masts intact. There are real drowned forests in the Great Lakes, the stumps of trees that grew thousands of years ago when the water was lower, still rooted to the old ground beneath the waves. There are real submerged sites elsewhere in these lakes, lines of stones left by people who walked that ground when it was dry land, before the water rose and covered the world they knew. The genuine past at the bottom of the water is strange enough that it never needed a fake paved road to make it worth the dive, and the real story of the lake's water is its own kind of drama. People have, in fact, moved and managed and fought over the levels of the Great Lakes for more than a century, with canals and dams and diversions, with engineering projects that reshaped the shorelines and changed how the water flowed between the lakes. The real history of human hands on this water is full of ambition and conflict and consequence. It just does not include a secret machine that drains an inland sea overnight. It is, in the end, a more interesting story, because it actually happened, and because the people in it were real and made real choices and left real records you can go and read. But the fake road is a better hook. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of all this. The legend spreads not because it is true, but because it is shaped to spread, built out of wonder and betrayal and secrecy, the exact ingredients that make a person lean in and pass it along. The truth has to compete with that, and the truth fights with one hand tied behind its back, because the truth is bound by what actually occurred, and the legend is bound by nothing at all. So the next time a story arrives wearing a title too perfect to resist, a title that promises a wonder and a cover-up in the same breath, let yourself feel the pull of it. That pull is human, and it is good. But then, ask the quiet question the legend hopes you will skip. Not, is this amazing? Amazing is easy. Ask instead, how would I know if this were false, and has anyone bothered to check? Those two questions are not the enemy of wonder. They are how wonder grows up without dying. They are the difference between standing on a road that is actually there and standing on one that only ever existed because the story needed it to. The road under Lake Erie was never real, but the desire to believe in it absolutely is. And of the two, the desire is the far more powerful thing, because the road, if it existed, would only have been buried once. The desire gets buried and surfaces again and again in every new story, every new title, every new whisper of something wondrous just beneath the water, waiting for someone willing to imagine it back into the light. We did that today. We imagined it together. We walked out onto the cold mud in the dark, and we put our hands on the impossible stone, and we felt, for a little while, what it would be like to live in a world where the great secret was real and within reach. And then we did the one thing the people in the legend never got to do. We looked at it clearly, in full light, and we named it for what it was. And now we let the water close over it again, not because anyone forced us to, but because we know the difference between a story we love and a thing that is true, and we are allowed to keep both, as long as we never confuse the one for the other. The water can hold a story and the truth at once, and so can we, carrying the wonder of the road in one hand and the honesty of the measured lake in the other, all the way back to the shore where the lanterns are still burning.